All right, so hinge cutting is definitely a buzzword when it comes to deer habitat management. Some guys love it, some guys hate it. Some guys say it's a terrible tool that should never be used. But for those that don't like it, I think what happens a lot of the time is that they maybe tried it once, and basically just made a glorified mess because they didn't take the time to actually study it and figure out what they were doing. So today I want to talk about 5 of the more common mistakes I see when it comes to hinge cutting, and I know these mistakes because I've made them all myself. All right, number 1, this is an easy one because this is the one that the first mistake that I ever made, hinge cutting, and one that I see a lot when guys post pictures online or I'm walking properties and they've tried hinge cutting. This one happens a lot, and it's simple. Just not removing enough canopy. You got to think about it. That hinge tree, like this tree right here, is still alive if you made a good hinge on it and you're hinging the right type of tree. So that tree's still alive, but that treetop still needs sunlight. So if this treetop right here, that's up in these trees, is sitting where it's not going to get much sunlight, eventually it's going to die. You can see on this tree, it's a box elder, which hinge great. It's already starting to die. There's some branches that are still alive, but this one is sitting too far in the shade, so it's likely going to die eventually. And what happens is guys will go and just cut the medium to smaller size trees and not knock down the big trees that are casting the most shade. And what ends up happening is those medium to small trees die. The big trees just fill in the little gaps that they actually made in the canopy, and they don't get any woody regen. The hinge trees don't stay alive, and essentially they just have a bunch of dead hinge trees. So this one's very common, happens all the time. Done it myself. When you make a hinge cut bedding area, you need something more like that. Big open space with lots of sun coming in for woody regen, sun feeding those treetops so that you can get that flusher growth, the trees stay alive, and you basically just get a living thicket. Something like that just don't work. All right, hinge cutting mistake number 2 is hinging the wrong types of trees. So one of the first areas that I ever went into in hinge cut on our farm was an area that was predominantly ironwood, and I hinged most of the ironwood in that area that day. Well, I came back a couple months later and 90+% of those trees were dead. Ironwoods just don't hinge well. They actually make a good hinge, but if you want that tree to stay alive, it's not going to stay alive and provide kind of that living treetop that you're looking for. So with ironwood, 9 times out of 10, I'm flush cutting them. I still will hinge them occasionally, just to kind of prop up the cover and make travel easier. Sometimes when I'm edge feathering, I'll hinge them because they don't break down very quickly, so I can drop other trees on top of them. Things like that. So if I want to kind of prop up that screen a little bit, or if I'm making a canopied bed, they stay up for quite a few years. They won't break down. But for the most part, ironwood do not stay alive when you hinge cut them. 9 times out of 10, they won't stay alive. So if you're looking for a beautiful living thicket with living ironwood treetops, you're not going to get it if you hinge cut them. Now, if you take a tree like a box elder, move over here, these do stay alive and they hinge very, very well. So you can see I got a ton of growth coming off of this box elder right over here. I got the hinge right there. You can see all the way up there that trunk is sprouting. There's all kinds of growth. Box elder hinge great. They're softer. They're normally leaning one way or another. So when you cut them, they have a nice slow descent, so they don't snap off as often. They're very highly preferred browse by the deer. So if you have an area with a lot of box elder, they make for a great hinge cut bedding area because they just hinge very, very well. So research the type of trees that you have in your area and start asking questions and see whether or not they hinge well or not. I've seen guys hinge aspen. You never want to hinge aspen. You always want to flush cut aspen. The best thing about aspen is the regen you get when you cut them. So flush cutting them is the way to go. And then there's some trees that are kind of in between where they hinge okay, but sometimes it's better, you're better off flush cutting them because you want to get that stump sprouts, which is also highly preferred by the deer. So get to know your trees and learn which trees hinge well and which trees don't. Mistake number 3, hinge cutting every single tree in the hinge cut bedding area. When I'm doing a hinge cut, a lot of it depends on kind of how the trees stack up in the area I'm going to cut. But more often than not, I'm flush cutting more trees than I'm hinge cutting. Because if you hinge cut every single tree in a hinge cut bedding area, it's going to get way too thick. It's going to be tough for the deer to move around. You want lots of open spaces like this for the deer to move around and just make it have that ease of movement. And then scattered hinge cuts that are set up to provide that bedding structure that the deer are looking for. So don't hinge cut every single tree. Most of the time, not every tree in the hinge cut bedding area hinges well anyway. So you're going to be flush cutting lots of trees. And the benefit when you flush cut a tree, if you know anything about mineral stumps, is that that whole root system is feeding those new sprouts that are coming off that stump. So therefore, it's going to be very, very highly nutrient dense preferred browse to the deer. So you want lots of flush cut stumps in your bedding area that are sprouting back and providing that really good browse. So mix up your cuts. Do some flush cuts, some hinge cuts. Don't hinge everything. It's going to get way too thick. Mistake number 4, not coming in and cleaning up your cuts once a year. So what happens when you hinge cut trees, you'll have branches overhead that are dead. They'll drop, they'll cut off traffic, make dead ends like this. You'll have trees that you maybe cut a little bit higher that'll settle a little bit, and maybe you got to clean it up so the deer can still move underneath it. But you should come into your hinge cut bedding area once a year. I like to do it early summer. That's my preferred time. And just clean it up. Just make sure it's easy for the deer to move around. Make sure the beds that you created are still open. I always have a backpack sprayer with me, and I spray out deer beds. I spray out trails. I trim trails back if the regen's starting to get super thick, just so the deer can move around a lot. But don't just set it and forget it. Come back once a year. I dedicate 4 to 8 hours, 1 day a year in each one of my bedding cuts, and just clean them up and make sure the deer can still use them and access them and that they're ready to go for the fall. Mistake number 5 is not varying your cuts. So some guys, I don't know who started the narrative that you can't make higher hinge cuts, that everything needs to be waist level or below. But that's just not true. You can definitely make some hinge cuts that are a little bit higher where the deer can move underneath them. And some deer love to have the bedding canopy of the hinge cut. So there's an impression back there. There's one there. It's kind of tough to see, but there's one there. There's one up around the log there. And what do they have overhead? A canopy. So give the deer everything. Don't put yourself in a box. Don't put the deer in a box and just think, okay, I have to cut everything waist level or lower. You can definitely make some slightly higher hinge cuts to make these canopied beds so that the deer can bed underneath them. I have a bunch of these types of beds in this hinge cut bedding area, and every single one of them has a deer that has bedded in it. They're beds that I set up and the deer use them. So vary your cuts. It's also nice if you cut some higher, because then the deer can move around a little bit easier. If you got a spot that's getting a little bit thicker and you cut some higher where the deer can get underneath them and just make travel corridors that way through your hinge cuts, it's nice. It's less cutting for you. And there's definitely a safe way to do it. I've heard the argument that you can't cut this way because that chain's right at face level. Well, I don't know. The guy that I saw do it put the chainsaw right in front of his face. Well, I don't know who cuts that way. I mean, you cut with the chainsaw off to your side. And I have a mask and my helmet and all my safety gear on. So there's definitely a way to do it safely and not put yourself in harm's way. Just make sure that you feel competent with the saw, and by all means, if you don't feel competent cutting that way, don't do it then. That's fine. But if you want to add a little extra to your hinge cut bedding areas and you feel good about running that saw and you feel like you can do it safely, varying your cuts, having some higher cuts, some lower cuts, some cuts in the middle is a great thing, because they all serve a purpose. Side cover's good, overhead canopy is good. Having cuts way low so they can browse on that stump is good. So yeah, vary the cuts. Here's a bonus hinge cutting mistake. I guess it's more of a belief. I've heard the belief that all you're doing is bringing the canopy to the ground. Yeah, right. That's not the case. You have maybe small areas where there's a little bit of shade from the hinge trees, but not every tree is going to stay alive that you hinge cut. They're going to act like natural seclusion cages, then even if they die, so that woody regen can come up through them and not get hit by the deer and start to provide viable cover. But look at this. I said you don't hinge cut every tree in a hinge cut bedding area. Look at all the stems that are coming up in this area. And that's because there's a big hole in the canopy. Tons of stems. A tree that's laying at a 45-degree angle is not casting nearly as much shade as it was when it was a full plumed out tree up in the canopy. I mean, it's casting barely any shade. Anybody that walks into a good hinge cut bedding area knows there is a ton of browse for deer, in the form of woody browse, in the form of herbaceous growth. As long as you're doing it right, you're blowing that canopy open, there's no such thing as just bringing the canopy to the ground and it's still shaded out and there's no growth underneath. That's just not true. Some final thoughts. If you don't like hinge cutting, or you're not convinced that it works, that's fine. Just don't do it. There's other ways to manage the timber. I think hinge cutting is a great tool and can be a very powerful tool when used correctly, but if you don't like it, just don't do it. But my advice is, if you haven't done it before, don't bash hinge cutting, because you don't know what you don't know, basically. And if you have done it before and it didn't work, and therefore you think it stinks as a timber management technique or a wildlife management technique, maybe talk to somebody that has done it before successfully. See if you can get them to come out to your property and check it out and maybe do some cutting together, because if you do it correctly, it can definitely be a tool that will work to improve your land's capacity to hold deer and just improve your overall hunting success. All right, you all take care. God bless.